day, ladies and gentlemen. It is my very pleasure to introduce you to today's session on financing sustainable energy access, building resilient and net zero local economies. Over the last few years, we've been hearing a lot from major stakeholders discuss the urgency of addressing climate change, as well as the role that innovative technologies, business models, and financial vehicles will need to play in addressing such a challenge. Today's session is a particularly relevant one, as we will be seeing how EU instruments can and must scale up resources to support the deployment of decentralized renewable energy solutions on the ground. Decentralized renewable energy solutions are not just fundamental to address the remaining energy access gap by 2030, but they are also a key ally to support rural communities in adapting to the impacts of climate change on the local resources, contributing to global mitigation efforts, as well as helping them recover faster and better from the current pandemic. And this is why we are extremely glad to launch our Decentralized Renewable Energy campaign today with the support of Get Invest to support international funding partners as well as decision makers to integrate DRE as a central element of their green recovery strategies. The campaign will comprise a set of activities, and amongst them, we will also have a photo competition that we have launched today. So if you are interested in participating, I will be looking forward to hearing from you. But let's go back to the session. During the first part of the session, we will hear the remarks from our distinguished speakers, Mr. William Lindberg, Policy Officer, External Relations from the Department for International Partnerships at the European Commission, as well as Mr. David Lecoq, CEO at the Alliance for Rural Electrification. The second part of the session will consist of a moderated panel discussion, where we will welcome key insights from private sector practitioners at the forefront of rural electrification efforts, complemented with expert remarks from two leading EU mechanisms specifically designed to address finance gaps in the DRE sector. Without further ado, I am delighted to introduce and invite our distinguished speaker, Mr. Lindberg, to kickstart the first part of the session.
So many thanks, Amanda, for this introduction, and good afternoon and welcome to everybody, both those who are joining us here today in the room and those who are joining us by any virtual means. I think this, of course, is an interesting format that we might see more going forward, this hybrid event. I would also like to thank ARE and Get Invest for this good organization of this event. So, one of the main topics of this year's COP is climate finance. And one of the goals of this year's event is really to increase global climate finance commitments to support a clean energy transition. And this is, of course, a completely fundamental and urgent endeavor, given the role of energy sector when it comes to emission. The energy sector is responsible for almost 3/4 of the emissions that have pushed global average temperatures 1.1 Celsius higher since the pre-industrial age. And according to the new World Energy Outlook that we have seen, to get the world on track for the 1.5 Celsius target would require close to $4 trillion of clean energy investments by 2030. And 70% of those investments will have to come in emerging economies and developing countries. So this is, of course, a huge challenge in developing economies, especially in the wake of the pandemic, where we know that finance is very scarce, capital remains still very expensive. And we know that COVID-19 has had a really detrimental impact in terms of energy access as well. Recent data is showing that the number of people without electricity access is set to rise in 2021 for the first time in a long time. It will rise with 2%, and almost all of the increase will happen in sub-Saharan Africa. And in addition to this, we've also seen a large rebound in terms of coal and oil use. So needless to say that there is really an urgent challenge for everyone, all involved stakeholders, to boost green energy investments. And here the public sector and development banks play really a crucial role. They play a crucial role to promote the necessary reforms, to promote the regulatory and legal frameworks that are conducive to investment, but also to come in with finance where the private sector might perceive it too risky. The EU is strongly committed in this regard and to contribute to this endeavor in the context of our Green Deal and the external dimension of the Green Deal. In our budget for development cooperation and DICE Global Europe, we have set a climate spending target of 30%, which means that 30% of all our spending will be relevant for climate action. And as you probably have heard, our President Ursula von der Leyen announced an additional 4 billion euros of spending for climate action until 2027. So much of this financing will obviously target the energy sector, where we are committed to boost investment. And this will be done, we can simplify it in a way and say it will be done through a threefold approach, where we will focus on policy dialogue with partner countries and with the private sector and other stakeholders, through technical assistance and capacity building to authorities and private developers, and also through financing, through the financial instruments. And under the financial instruments, we will speak about some of them today here with Electrify, for instance. We have Electrify, Climate Investor 1, Facility for Energy Inclusion, ARESUF. We have so far supported 87 projects across the globe with a total of 109 million euros of investments. And this has leveraged about 675 million euros of additional investments from external financiers. So despite all the good work that's been carried out so far from many different stakeholders, there is still a lot to do to close the financing gap. The panelists that you will see here today, they consist of fund managers, project developers, private sector. They are really doing a fundamental and important work to spur the green energy transition. They will explain to you more in detail here about the gaps and the barriers that they see in the renewable energy sector. And they will also provide their own stories as beneficiaries of EU-funded instruments. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. And with all this said, I would like to welcome you once again to this session. And I wish you a really fruitful discussion. And with that, I leave the floor to the CEO of the Alliance of Rural Electrification, David Lecoq. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, William, for your kind words and kind opening indeed of this panel here today, that we are indeed extremely happy to welcome all our friends and especially partners, members, both physically as well as online in this new world of virtual conferencing. We are, as ARE, as you know, federating both the oldest as well as the largest amount of companies in the distributed renewable energy sector. And when I hear the words you pronounce, as well as being last week in Glasgow, the commitment, let's say, of the European Union moving forward, the same with the news of, was it yesterday, of the EU joining the High Ambition Coalition. This is obviously extremely important as a signal towards us, towards the private sector, of the continuation, I say continuation, of the involvement of the EU when it comes to climate action, and including notably through the spread of renewable energy, distributed renewable energy throughout the world, because the two are obviously very, very closely linked. Indeed, we see from ARE's side that now with the double whammy of COVID and the climate changing today already, it's not a future story anymore, it's already happening today, as we know, that countries are really faced with a choice. Shall we build back the way we know it, which will only lead to catastrophe down the line, or shall we build back better, in the words of also the US climate plan, and actually turn this story into something positive, because that is, I think, a message that often gets lost in the translation, is that the climate change, it's very much actually like energy access. It's a big public objective to do something about it. We need to address it, but we can do it in a way that creates opportunity, that creates jobs, that is good for the economy, and that delivers on multiple KPIs at the same time. In this case, clean energy access, green job creation, as well as effectively addressing climate change. So in that regard, distributed renewables, I would like to highlight the role of that, because it obviously underpins the achievement of pretty much every one of the Sustainable Development Goals. And next to that, it is also estimated independently by the IEA to be the least cost, so otherwise cheapest solution to address more, to provide more than half of all the new connections needed to electricity. So we know that today there is almost 800 million people that still, in 2021, do not have electricity, and another 1.5 billion or so that have an awful connection with brownouts and blackouts. Well, we can effectively, cheaply, and concretely address that in the short term with distributed renewables. And that's why I think this ambition that the European Union has on the climate front, as well as on the energy access front, where it has led the way since many years and where it's doubling down now as we are in the race to 2030, that is extremely important to hear as a signal to us in the private sector. So, and the way also, if I can highlight, to do that through impact-oriented programs, whether it's Get Invest, with whom we are able to organize this and many other activities that we would otherwise struggle to do, as well as the financial instruments of an Electrify and others. That is also a very pragmatic and concrete way. So we definitely applaud these efforts. The only thing we would recommend is please keep it coming. Please do much more of it. We have a good foundation that we have tried and tested over the past few years. Now we have, I think, 8.5 years to go. So let's double down on the mechanisms we know and together go to 2030 and actually sit here 8 years from now looking back like, look, we have fought climate change, we have developed, we have reached SDG 7, and we have created a lot, millions of jobs in the process. I think if we can set ourselves that as goals, we will all be, and the world especially, the better for it. So thank you very much. I took a bit more time, excuse me, Madam Moderator, but I shall pass the floor back to you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely not a problem, David, and I was delighted to hear those insightful remarks from our distinguished speakers. I think a couple of very interesting data were shared, and I think we all agree that we are particularly delighted to hear from big players like the European Commission how they are committed to this cause. And I think there was a very interesting information that Mr. Lindberg shared, that 70% of climate investment will need to flow towards emerging markets. And in that regard, I would also like to highlight David's point that at the moment there is still 780 million people without access to energy, as well as 1.2 billion people with unreliable access to energy. I would like to highlight that the technology is there, the resources are there, and our main priority must be to find the right mechanisms to put them in place in order to ensure that those resources flow in the right direction, in this case towards decentralized renewable energy. With that, I would like to move on to the second part of the session, to our panel of experts. And perhaps the EU technical team would be so kind to show the Slido QR on the screen. And here I would like to invite the audience to ask any questions, share any remarks that you might have. We are looking forward to hearing from you. And also feel free to use the hashtag COP26 to do live tweeting of the session if you find something particularly interesting that you would like to share. But moving back to the panel, the panel will discuss key insights, on the one hand from private practitioners on the ground that are at the forefront of rural electrification efforts. And those insights will also be complemented by the EU financial mechanisms themselves, who are sitting with us here today. With this in mind, I would like to actually open the floor to our panel of experts, who will dive deeper into the topic of the session. And I would like to introduce you on the private sector side. to Mr. Matt Orosz, CEO and founder at One Power, Mr. Steven Fleureux, Chief Financial Officer at NG Energy Access, as well as Mr. Mansour Amayoun, co-founder and CEO at Bbox. On the other side, the perspective of EU financial mechanisms will be impersonated by Ms. Ilham Talab, Technical Advisor at GetInvest, as well as Mr. Dominic de Koning, Chief Investment Officer at EDFI Management Company. And with that, I think we could perhaps start with the conversation with the private practitioners' point of view. So I would like to address the next question to Mr. Orosz. Mr. Orosz, you have quite an interesting profile, and I know that you've benefited both from the support of GetInvest and EDFI Electrify. I would be very interested to hear more about your fundraising path. Perhaps you can share some insights into what are the main challenges that you faced along the way, and also, if I may, how have you seen the role of EU instruments in supporting you to address those challenges? Thank you. Mr. Orosz, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks for the invitation to join the panel. Just to give you a quick background, One Power is it's an IPP based in Lesotho. We're about 35 employees, and we have an on-grid and off-grid focus in renewable energies. Specifically with EU support, we're looking at the mini-grid side of the business to electrify about 7,000 households across 53 villages in Lesotho through a portfolio approach with 10 concession areas that were awarded through a tender that was run by the UN, and with concessions that were signed with the Ministry of Energy. It's kind of a long and complex topic to talk about the path that gets us here, so I'll try to summarize. But we initially approached the idea of building mini grids in Lesotho in 2013, and it's 2021 now, and we brought the country's first fully licensed, privately financed mini grid online at Hamakebe in May of this year. So what took so long from 2013 to 2021? And I think that the answer is partly due to the inherent challenges of building off-grid infrastructure in places like Lesotho. It's very mountainous terrain. It's difficult for vehicles to move equipment, utility poles, inverters, batteries, panels up and down these mountains. In some cases, we end up having to repair or create road infrastructure to be able to access these areas. So there's some inherent challenges in bringing electricity to remote parts of Lesotho. That being said, until the pandemic and kind of the global logistics crisis, I would say that in terms of pricing, the technology has never been at a more mature and ready and affordable state. So the cost reductions in PV panels, in batteries, the availability of smart meters, all of these are conditions that make the mini grid business favorable. But the challenges that make the project development cycle so long, I think, are both on the side of the local jurisdictions, the lack of mini grid regulatory frameworks, the inexperience of regulators, of ministries, of even the banking sector to understand and to contend with these transactions. And then I think there's also, a lot of goodwill on the part of financiers, but also, sometimes a misunderstanding of the gaps between the expectations and the types of frameworks that exist in these countries and the types of project finance structures that are traditional or comfortable or familiar to financiers. So I think it's very critical to have a holistic approach where technical assistance can be deployed to provide legal and technical support to stakeholders and counterparties in mini-grid transactions, while at the same time, project development finance for feasibility studies, as well as affordable, low cost of capital, project finance, debt, and equity for the projects themselves. And in this regard, we are grateful to EU support. They co-financed our feasibility study, which enabled us to build the country's first mini grid and to become the first concessionaire to be in a position to deploy mini grids at scale in Lesotho, which we're currently in the process of reaching financial close and building out those mini grids that I mentioned for 7,000 households, businesses, schools, clinics, churches, police stations in very remote parts of Lesotho across 53 villages. So I'll pause there and be happy to answer any more questions in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Mr. Urs. And I see that you made a couple of really good points. And of course, at this session, we are focusing on the main challenges, but I am also very glad to hear how the EU instruments were fundamental in supporting you to be where you are today. Definitely the lack of specific knowledge from local actors, for instance, local financial entities, to move these transactions ahead is something that we've seen and we hear from our network of 185 companies quite often. But I am very hopeful that this is being progressively addressed via international efforts and as well as political willingness and the willingness from local actors to support this industry that you mentioned. Now I would like to turn to our colleagues from NG Energy Access as well as PBOX, because you follow a different fundraising path, however successful as well. And perhaps it would be interesting to hear what similarities and differences you have experienced compared to the experience that Mr. Urs has shared. And perhaps you could build a little bit more on where do you see the main funding gaps are, and as well how EU instruments could be fundamental or could support even further companies like you to address those gaps.
All right, thank you, Amanda, for giving the opportunity to speak to this event. So before entering maybe into the different questions, I just want to take a little bit of time to explain where NG Energy Access stands for, actually. So we have been created, NG Energy Access has been created in October last year, and it's actually the combination of three companies. So it's Phoenix and Mobisol in the solar home systems space, and it's Power Corner in the mini-grid space. So these three companies have now been brought together, and together we provide safe and reliable solar to, for the moment, 6.5 million people in Africa. So through the sale of these solar home systems under the pay-as-you-go model, and at the same time we develop and operate and own these mini-grid projects. So for the moment we have about 1,800 employees within NG Energy Access, of which 90 to 95% are based in Africa, and we are operational in 9 countries for the moment. So in terms of funding, what we have done up to now is mainly focused our funding activities into securing senior debt and working facilities for different of our countries. And at the same time, we have also been able to benefit from the different grant programs that have been developed in the different countries. But we are quite ambitious, and we want to achieve 20 million or impact 20 million lives by 2025, and further integrate and strengthen the business model that we have created within NG Energy Access. And in order to do that, we have created a funding strategy which is axed on different levers, actually. So one of them is continue to secure external funding, so which can come from different sources, and it depends on the level where we're gonna try to secure this funding. So for the moment we are targeting 3 levels. So one is at the, let's say, the global level or the holding level, then you can have it at the country level, and then you can have it at the project level. So each of these levels determine the potential debt funder in this project. Secondly, is to continue to focus on the grant programs, so these result-based finance programs that are being rolled out are very interesting for us as a developer as well, because we have clear milestones that we have to commit in order to get access to the funds. So I think it's a win-win situation for us as a developer, but also for the government and the donor. Thirdly, we also focus on equity. So in the different projects that we have, we also welcome other investors, so to jointly develop these projects. And lastly, we try to focus as well on elements like CO2 certificates, also continued our efforts to mobilize the diaspora funding to flow funds back to Africa. So in developing this strategy and securing these funds, we have indeed encountered a couple of bottlenecks. A first important one is actually to have access to local currency funding. So all of our activities are actually have revenues in local currency. So we have a clear currency risk because the equipment we buy, they are in hard currency. So access to local currency funding is a way to mitigate that risk, and it's actually one of our objectives to secure that quite quickly. A bit linked to that is actually the involvement of the local commercial banks. So it's quite difficult to get these local financial institutions involved in the different activities. We have had long discussions with them, but at the end of the day, it remains a hurdle to bring them on board. A third one is mainly linked to the mini-grids development, and that's more standardization of the tender processes. So we've seen that in different countries there are different tender processes, but they're not always standardized, which leads to actually a longer time or lead time to get the project finalized and off the ground. So further standardization in terms of documentation, financing, and so on would also further help to accelerate the development. And then the last one is a link to the risk allocation. So when we have these discussions with these debt investors, of course it's always a balance between the debt terms and the risk that they are taking, but that often takes quite a lot of time, and it's not always easy to find the right balance actually for all the parties. So that were, for me, the main bottlenecks in terms of the financing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fleurs. I think, I see very relevant points here. So you mentioned, well, first of all, I'm very interested in the different sources that you've mentioned. You have quite a healthy combination, and particularly glad to hear about CO2 certificates, because this is, I think, a stream that it's becoming more and more trendy, and we are within ARI actually looking at it ourselves. And I think this would be a great opportunity to turn to our experts from the EU mechanisms themselves, and particularly where they see, or if they coincide in your view, about the main challenges within the sector, as well as how they are addressing them, perhaps with a particular focus on the 4 different challenges that you will mention. So access to local currency funding, local involvement of banks, the standardization of the tendering process, and as well as finding a balance between the different stakeholders involved. Perhaps I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Ilham Talab. Ilham, I think you're with us.
Yes, thanks a lot, Amanda. I hope you can hear me properly. My name is Ilham Talab, and I'm technical advisor with Get Invest. Pleasure to be here with all of you virtually, but unfortunately not physically this time. Maybe just before digging into the question, Amanda, I would like to give a brief background about Get Invest for those that haven't heard of the program yet. So we are a European program. We are mainly supporting investments in decentralized renewables. So this is our aim, our goal. And we are very active in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Now, the program wouldn't have been possible without the support of the European Union, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Austria, and we are implemented by the German Development Agency, GIZ. So it's really interesting discussion and all the points mentioned before with my fellow panelists, because we brush on and we act on many of the previously mentioned challenges and gaps, whether it is to really bring in quality projects to the doorstep of financiers through the work that we do with our through our TA facility that we call the Finance Catalyst, Get Invest Finance Catalyst, where we work directly with the developers and the businesses, including here, for example, with One Power, one of the examples that we are very happy to have been working with and support. To bring in high quality projects, bankable projects, investment ready projects to the doorstep of financiers. So this is one of the major services that we provide. And we've been active over the past 5 years. I can say that we have worked with over 200 companies, out of which we've mobilized an estimated amount of over €1 billion to the doorstep of financiers. And we have closed over 500 million in transactions. So in terms of gaps, probably you allow me to talk from the perspective of Get Invest, in terms of what we see, the trends happening, and how are we providing solutions from our perspective to the sector. So when it comes to some funding trends or gaps, we see definitely there is a trend of financiers becoming much more sophisticated and specialized, although, as mentioned previously by William from the Commission, indeed there is continuous lack of overall volumes of funding that need to flow to the sector to achieve the target that we're all behind, which is energy for all by 2030. So we see a lot of emergence of specialized debt, off-grid debt funders. There are over 20 of them in the sector currently, with over 2 billion under management. For equity, indeed, there is still a lot of dearth of equity providers, especially for early stage businesses and earlier stage equity. But still, there is some innovation happening as well. For the grants, and earlier stage funding, there is obviously a lot of competition from fund seekers because there is less demand than needed, but we're also notice a lot of the RBF schemes, which was also mentioned by another panelist here, that are emerging more and more in the sector. So overall, while the volume is overall not as needed, but there is a lot of innovation in the type and way of delivery of these financing solutions, which is encouraging. And our job as a TA support instrument is really to create that match between the projects and the financiers. And we've been in a very privileged situation, working with both ends and seeing the pain points of both ends. So also from the financier side, there is always that quest for the pipeline. I think all the financiers would agree with me that it is difficult to tap into high quality investment ready funding applications. And this is where, as I mentioned, we try to fill in the gap. Another point that I would like to mention, which was mentioned by, I think, Energy Access, about the local currency financing. This is something that is definitely challenging. We have been recently working in this area as well, in terms of trying to help local banks in certain markets where we see there are some low-hanging fruits. Obviously, this is a very, very challenging situation, as we all know, in terms of local currency financing. But in certain markets, in certain countries, there are some low-hanging fruits that we believe local banks should start to tap into. However, they need some support, and this is where we're coming into play as well, trying to work with them to help them understand the risk profiles of these specific clean energy off-grid investments and try to tap into these opportunities. Another thing that we're also started recently is to extend the TA support that we provide to specifically support locally owned and managed companies. Especially in the wake of COVID, there was a lot of discussion about how can we all maintain the progress that was established so far towards energy access for all, and the question mark was how to continue to support and more support the locally owned and managed companies. So we've launched recently a new service that we're calling the Finance Readiness Support. the finance readiness support will really complement the other services that we provide and be able to provide more deep dive, hand-holding, really deeper business development support to the companies that need it at the most. These are the companies that are working with the last mile, delivering great impact, whether it is related to gender inclusion or creating jobs in very, very difficult and challenging situations. So we're very glad to be able to launch that service as well. Maybe I leave it at that, and if there's any follow-up questions, we can take them as they come. Amanda?
Perfectly, and thank you very much, Ilham. I think it's great to have a mixed perspective at the panel, both from the private perspective and from the EU mechanisms themselves. So I think it's been great to hear about the status of the different funding sources within the market, as well as the point that grant funding, however, it is an essential part of addressing the finance gaps in our sector, but it is also a very crowded space. And I think the work that you do in supporting companies access other types of funding, it's very beneficial. And I think your contribution would be also a great point to be addressed by our next speaker, Mr. Amayun from our STEAM member BBox. Perhaps you could use the experiences shared by the previous private sector speakers, as well as comment on the presentation shared by Mrs. Talab at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you for having us. Sorry, I couldn't be there in person. In terms of financing, to electrify the world, we need to mobilize billions of dollars, right? That's absolutely essential to do. And at BBox, one of the core focus has been how the hell do we get access to capital to fulfill the ambitions that we have as a company? And we've been lucky on that front. We've been able to raise over $200 million worth of capital in different sources and have been part of many milestone transactions, whether it's from getting this into the VC world. We were one of the first companies in the sector that did the Series A financing from Khosla, Series B from Bamboo, Series C from MKB and NG, and Series D from Mitsubishi Corporation, raising equity level, but also looking at the debt side as well. We were one of the first companies that were able to actually look at getting local banks involved and getting local debt financing. So the BPR financing that we did in Rwanda in 2016 was one of the first times that there was a local debt financing for a local company without any third-party guarantees based in place, a $2 million financing that we did in Rwanda. And why? Data. The moment we were able to actually have a lot of data on our customer base, we were able to actually demonstrate repayment cycles, we were able to demonstrate our own professionalism, our own legitimacy, investing in the people, etc., and structures, everything from accounting to reporting to actually like the local know-how. We're able to actually start getting that sort of local currency financing in place. So now we have local debt financing in most countries. So we refinance receivables from local banks. The thing I would argue about is it's not cheap, right? I would love it to get cheaper, right? And that's the main point. But the fact that local banks are getting involved is huge. And I think that's something. Of course, like some of the EU facilities and DFI facilities, like guarantees, etc., is making it even more accessible, right? Which is fantastic, right? On the second front as well is also equity at the local level. So when we have to invest in Kenya, in Rwanda, in DRC, in Togo, and we're starting new markets, like for example, Nigeria or Burkina Faso, we need equity, right? To invest, who is going to invest equity at the local fragile market level, right? Where there's so much underlying risk here. And to be able to solve that question, we actually set up a GPLP structure together with Bamboo Capital Partners called Beam, where Electrify is one of the LPs. And that has actually helped us to launch Burkina Faso. It helped us to launch Togo. It helps us to launch Nigeria. Basically, they can provide the first few dollars that we need from an equity perspective to kickstart those markets and to be able to actually grow them to a level where we have data, where we have transparency, where we have governance, etc. And the interesting thing that's happening in this space is that there's a lot of interest. if you can make the structures work, if you can make the cash flow become positive, you can have the structures that you need, there is a lot of third-party interest. So one of the examples is just earlier this year, we sold 20% of our Kenyan company to EDF. 50% of our Togolese company last year we sold to EDF. The year before, we sold 30% of our DRC business to AIM, the old mutual group. So the fact that there are infrastructure investors now interested to invest at the local level is huge, right? And that's something that we need to do more of, etc. But it requires a certain level of sophistication, it's a certain level of vision that might not be, which we have to actually promote across the industry much more. I have two last points to say, and I promise to shut up. The other big point I want to mention is that we need to be able to combine clean cooking and energy and electricity. For some obscure set of reason, we sort of divide electricity in one bucket and cooking on another bucket. The truth is, at the household level, this is an energy expenditure, right? So unless we don't solve the energy expenditure overall, we're never going to make people escape energy poverty, right? And I think it's extremely important we start working together. I think like things like carbon credits, etc., will force that two worlds to start working much more together than ever before. And the last point I want to also say is the fact on receivable financing, right? The only way, where my starting point was, we need billions of dollars to flow in. That cannot come in form of equity. It cannot come in form of on-balance sheet debt. The only way that those billions of dollars can actually flow into our sector is by the fact of some sort of off-balance sheet financing. And we were the first company on the continent to do a securitization in Kenya. And I can tell you it's really hard, right? And to do that in like 10 countries is even harder, right? So if there's one area of support where I think could be catalytic change, if there was some sort of securitization program for the industry, multi-currency, multi-jurisdiction, with an eligibility criteria, I think that could change the game, both from mini-grid space, for a solar home system space, and the clean cooking space. I think that's where a lot of support is needed. And of course, with like subsidies and DFI support at the improving affordability, there are more and more customers that are being created that are potentially bankable at scale. So let me just shut up there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amayun, and I think it's been great to hear your expert insights on the topic. It was also great to hear, and we definitely coincide with the fact that there's more and more infrastructure investors chipping into our market and willing to invest in local equity. You made a really good point by mentioning the importance of data to build a business case, to unlock partnerships on the ground and different types of finance. And I particularly like the part where you mentioned, well, you're called to work together to unify the work from the household electrification sector with clean cooking, and particularly to welcome new sources of funding such as carbon credits. And we will definitely be very willing to talk about this more into detail as we develop our own campaigns activities. And here, perhaps this will be a great opportunity for Mr. Dekkening to reflect a little bit on the points that were shared.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for this excellent discussion. Thank you, Mansour. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Stephen. It's very important for us to be with the practitioners, with the companies who make it happen on the ground, and to hear from their experience and how we can continue to improve our offering to the sector. Electrify, in a nutshell, we are a 250 million facility, a blended finance facility that allows us to take a very distinct position in financing these companies. First of all, my gratitude to the European Union. We are fully funded by the European Union, and this is a blended finance facility that allows us to intervene in early stages with risk capital, with the aim to catalyze additional investors. And that is also what Mansour, amongst others, next to Stephen and Matt, is doing, building a track record in this sector, making it bankable, and we would like to be a very important element therein. To echo on what has been said, what we see as main funding barriers is lack of equity, even if increasingly companies are succeeding in attracting equity, it remains most needed long-term, structured around equity-like in significant amounts, so that the company is not continuously fundraising, but has significant amounts to be able to roll out its business plan for a number of years, and in a sustained effort, because the road ahead of many of these early stage companies is quite bumpy, so we need to be long tenor and we need to be supportive to the cash flow generation possibilities that they have. So those are three of the main barriers that we see continuously in the market of distributed renewable energies, structured around equity, significant in amount, and in a sustained effort. Ilham made a comment about increasingly available debt facilities, which we obviously welcome, because the sector, as it has been mentioned also by William, needs a lot of financing to further develop. We welcome the sophisticated engineering and the financial modeling that is taking place. Yet at the same time, I think it's important to also recognize that such sophisticated engineering should not leave the practitioners with all of the challenges. And I think if we really want to accelerate the market of distributed renewable energy, we really need to accommodate for the needs and cash flow generation capacities of these companies. So having financial engineering is most welcome, can allow to build track record, can make further financing to the sector available, yet it should be very balanced. And that is maybe an additional comment that I would like to make with respect to the evolution in the sector. Let me leave it there. If you have further questions, always happy to answer.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. De Koning. And definitely, I think you made a great point by highlighting that financial engineering, it's fantastic, but it should be targeted at the concrete needs of the companies themselves and support the flow of resources into the sector, as opposed to being a bottleneck to it. The lack of equity finance, I think this is a point that has been mentioned before by our colleague from Get Invest. But I think this is time now to perhaps open the floor to our Q&A, the questions from the audience. So I'm here inviting the audience again to scan Slido QR and let us know if you have any questions, any remarks. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. And here I'm going to take a look at the questions that we've already received. So one first question that we've received is, how could carbon credits contribute to securitization of mini-grid projects? Perhaps this is a question that I would like to address to our EU funding mechanisms colleagues. So perhaps, Ilham, you would like to have a first go at it.
Yeah, we're hearing more and more about carbon credits, especially related to mini-grids, but also clean cooking. It's the main challenge that is that the companies face is the complexity of making it work. It's still very complex. You can only do it through like specialized firms that can do the accounting for you, etc. So there is still some barriers, in my opinion, to make it a mainstream. Yet there are promising, let's say, outlooks, given also the role of data, what Mansour just mentioned. So with more and more internet-connected systems, with more and more pay-go systems, data collection becomes much more easier, more accurate, and cheaper. And because of that, that could indeed unlock the markets of carbon financing for the energy access sector.
Thank you very much, Ilham. Mr. De Koning.
Yeah, I think it would also be great to hear from Stephen and Mansour on this, amongst others. But so I think data is key, and what we can offer in return for these cash flows. Data is a key ingredient, as well as the portfolio approach that was mentioned by Matt, I think, is essential so as to make a significant package of carbon credits that is becoming available that to a certain extent would mitigate one of the barriers to it, which is how to implement it, at what cost, how to certify all of this. So that is, I think, from my point of view, the addition next to data to have a portfolio approach to have significant amounts of credits that can be traded and can become an additional source of income to those mini-grids projects, amongst others.
Thank you very much, Mr. De Koning, and thank you for highlighting again the importance of data to unlock further capital. Perhaps our colleagues from the private sector would like to reflect upon this particular question. Mr. Fleur, perhaps you could have a go at it.
Yeah, the elements I would like to add, indeed, data is key because we have to provide some kind of history to get access to the carbon credits, but the process itself is quite complex as well. So if efforts could be made actually to try to make that process more fluid. Also, it takes quite a long time before we are able, from the time we submit for the certificates to the time we are able to secure them. We have to go through a different step process, which is quite complex and takes quite some time. So indeed, if this could be more smoothened, that would also be helpful.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fleur. Perhaps our colleagues from BBOX, our colleague from BBOX could let us know, Mr. Hamayoun, do you share the same opinion? Do you see any other challenges to access this type of financing, or what would be your opinion in this matter?
I think there's three words in there. There's mini-grid, securitization, and carbon, right? Each of them has its own specific set of challenges, right, to solve in itself, right? So carbon has to first be proven to be a viable and scalable option for the energy access space in general, right? And I think we're a little bit away from that. The pricing is a little bit low, the verification is a little bit too painful, etc. And hopefully as the pricing goes up, that actually makes it meaningful, right? On mini-grid side, we need scale, right? So if there is enough scale there, enough size there, then number one becomes easier to do, because even if the carbon pricing is 10 times what it is today, if there's not enough mini-grids, then it's going to be difficult to be able to put that programmatically in place here. And the third part is the securitization, right? There's two specific challenges here. One is legality, right? Securitization means some sort of true sale event going in place, some sort of asset co-creation. What you do in Tanzania wouldn't be applicable in Zambia, would not be applicable in Benin, right? So I think it's very important to look at securitization in sort of a localized context, and it requires operational data, right? So you need to securitize something that already exists, right? Rather than to be able to create that. I personally believe the carbon financing can play a role in financing the construction of mini-grids, to be able to provide the pre-financing that's needed to be able to actually create these mini-grids, etc., or other assets, then could be securitized. I think that's the order of events that probably is much more investable or bankable rather than the other way around, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much, Hamayoun, and a really interesting point about using climate finance for pre-financing and for the construction of mini-grids themselves. I think perhaps it would be a great moment to contrast your opinion with that of Mr. Ores. Mr. Ores, the floor is yours.
Sorry, was on mute. I think that we're talking about various mechanisms to transfer funds, to transfer funds around that are essentially a subsidy, right? Whether it's carbon credits or it's just, RBF grant or concessional finance, we're essentially talking about subsidizing energy access. And I'm not opposed to any of those, as long as we're all aware that we're talking about market distortions on some fundamental level. And as somebody who stakes their business on, selling electricity, I think that, the the ability to access subsidy or concessional funds or carbon credits because there's a concern about climate change, is useful, and we can try to incorporate that into our business model whenever it's available. But I would never depend on it. The only thing that I would depend on is that electricity is a commodity that's worth paying for, and that customers want quality, affordable electricity. So for me, a cost-reflective tariff, a regulatory regime that allows market forces to work, ultimately results in the players prevailing in the market that do the best job at connecting the customer with what they want, which is affordable electricity. So in my view, it's I think that the subsidies are nice to have, but they might end up creating a market in which players that are clever at accessing subsidies, clever at the applications for becoming carbon credit compliant, or clever at getting grants, might succeed in the market when their fundamental business model is not necessarily the best. So I think if we want to get at the fundamental truth of who can deliver a kilowatt hour of electricity from a clean source to the people that need it the most, then I think that we should look at ways to subsidize that do not create distortions. So for me, that would be creating voucher systems, direct to consumer subsidy. Even things like universal basic income, but allowing the customer to have more purchasing power. That would be the kind of subsidy that I would prefer, because then that results in no distortion in terms of what's happening on the renewable energy provider side. So that's my potentially controversial opinion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ors. And I think I think you've made a really good point by not making us deviate from the importance that cost-effective tariffs have, as well as the importance of having an enabling environment in place as a fundamental condition to scale up DRE investments. We are running a bit short of time here, so perhaps I always like to wrap up sessions with a message of hope, with a clear message, a call to action that the audience can reflect upon. So perhaps before we rapidly wrap up, I would like to ask each one of our speakers to share very quickly in one line, if you had to give a piece of advice or make a short call to action to a particular stakeholder of choice, what would that be? I don't have a specific order in mind, so perhaps we can go from left to right, and then address these points from our beloved remote speakers. Mr. Fleurs.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. So my message would be actually for all the panelists. Actually, let's work together. So I think we have different parties around the table. So if we are able to work more together, I think we will be able to have quicker these as the G7 objectives achieved.
Thank you very much.
Happy to take that invite to work together with all of you even more intensively. What we want to continue walking our path with Electrify. We are also exploring the feasibility of a follow-on investment window, which could de-risk the sector even more for follow-on investments, because with blended finance, we are very much focused on early stage with equity-like. Companies' growth, their financing needs are growing. Maybe they do not qualify yet for DFI funding, and that is our role also as the DFI management company to build the pipelines of the future. So if we could have a de-risking window there, that could allow for such follow-on financing to be put in place to further push the growth of these companies, I think that would be very much welcomed, and this is what we would very much like to explore together with the European Union as our main partner in this, and the DFIs. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dekening. Mr. Lecoq?
Yes, always choosing one recommendation is difficult, I suppose. If there's one point I'd like to underline here is that, and also what we're doing with ARE is really more and more complementing our international work, or our, let's say, work at the regional level in Africa, in the Caribbean, Pacific, Asia, and so on, with also national lines of activity, let's say, so that they're mutually benefiting each other, because we, as ARE, really pride ourselves in being the federation of the entire distributed renewable energy space, from the very large companies like an NG Energy Access, like a Beerbox, all the way to very small startups on the ground in target markets. And that is definitely something we want to do. So we have a strategy in mind for energy access, for job creation, for climate, and we want to do that in a two-pronged approach, internationally and nationally, obviously, with our long-standing partner, the European Union, everywhere where it is possible to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lecoq. Mr. Lindberg?
Thank you. So my message would be, in order to close this financing gap that we have mentioned, and I mentioned in introduction, it's absolutely fundamental and essential to have a concerted approach. No? Technical assistance alone is not enough. Political messages and commitments alone are not enough. Financing instruments alone are not enough. So we really have to use all those in a concerted approach, and as Stephen said, work together as a team with all stakeholders, public sector, private sector, development banks, NGOs, academia, all of us.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mr. Lindberg. Last but definitely not least, our remote colleagues. Perhaps Mr. Hamayoun, you could go first.
Yeah, sure. I'm the impatient type, and we've promised the world to electrify everyone by 2030 as a sector, right? So if I do the math, we need to do 50,000 connections per day, right? As a sector, as together, and we're behind as a sector. We need to do more. But the technologies exist. And in other words, if we assume each connection costs $100, we need to mobilize $5 million per day, which in the grand scheme of things is not much, right? So we need to get there faster, and we need to find mechanisms to unlock both financing and scale in those markets much quicker. So let's hurry up.
Thank you very much for this very concise piece of advice, Mr. Hamayoun. Mr. Ors, would you like to have a go?
Maybe just leave with a question. We're already importing most of the technology and product that we use to electrify Africa from China and East Asia. Do we have a strategy for inviting sources of capital from that region to partner in the financing of energy access in Africa?
Please, we look forward to hear your recommendation. Ilham, are you with us? Can you hear us?
Yes, sorry, I did not hear your question. So I suppose I'm just going to give the call to action, or do you want me to do something?
Exactly, yeah, sorry.
Yes, perfect. So I'm going to be very opportunistic. As a TA program, we would love to work with as many project developers and businesses as possible to help them reach the doorstep of financiers. So I'm going to say, go to our website, check our finance catalyst on the first row, and apply for our support. We're here to help you, to serve you. That's our job. And I support what Mansour mentioned before about getting to 2030. I think the question now is not about getting there, it's how fast are we going to get there. So we need to join all hands, partner with everyone, and get those projects into an investment-ready stage. And we are here to do that. So reach out to us.
Thank you very much, Ms. Taleb, and thank you very much to all our great speakers here with us today. We've discussed the role that the dairy sector plays in supporting rural communities and addressing climate change. We've discussed the main bottlenecks, funding bottlenecks in our sector, as well as key pieces of advice. With this, I would like to also give a big thank you to our organizing partners of the session to make this event a success, as well as to the audience for accompanying us as we address this exciting and urgent point, as well as to the patient organizing team for the instrumental support to organize this session. Last point that I mentioned, the RE team is organizing an evening reception today from 6:30 to 8:30 at this very venue. So if you liked the content that we share here, we will be looking forward to welcoming you to discuss this topic further. Thank you very much.